right, thank you for joining us for the final session in the TriNetX Summer Bootcamp 2025. I'm Daniel Novak, Director of Student Scholarly Activities at the UCR School of Medicine, and I teach this bootcamp every year to help prepare our students to use TriNetX as part of our core curriculum. But I am also, very glad to see that it's being used by faculty, by residents, and by all sorts of folks to get a handle on it. Last year's bootcamp was watched 3,200 times just for the first episode, and I think all in all, it's got like 5,000 or 6,000 watches to it, so that's cool. And hopefully this year will be just as useful and exciting for everybody. We're on our final session. This is it, the last one, and this one's in some ways not as directly in the TriNetX system. I think I've shown you guys all of the necessary components in the previous week's videos. Now we're going to talk about what you do once you've completed your project. And this is where we're going to start with week 6, posters, manuscripts, and writing tools, and thinking about how to get from your well-designed final product to an actual manuscript or poster or research product. You already learned all the stuff that I got to teach you about the TriNetX interface. All the details, all the tacit knowledge I got has been baked in here. So, you should know how to navigate the interface, identify worthwhile projects, compare outcomes between cohorts, and use propensity score matching to reduce confounders. And I think those are really core components for that. Today, we're going to talk about exporting your data, how to structure a literature review examples of a good TriNetX study, look at some next-gen tools, look at some examples of student work. We'll look at some AI tools as well that I think are going to be really useful in helping you develop good quality projects. Diving right into it, we're going to look back. We talked about this at the end of session 4, but this is exporting your data. And this is actually, we're going to come back to this in a little while as to why this is a useful practice. But, it can be sometimes that you want to export all of your data, your findings from your study out of TriNetX. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is TriNetX is a very dynamic system, meaning there's no one day. It's kind of like an ocean, right? There's no one day in which all of the data available are all identical, right? It changes. They add new systems routinely. Since we joined TriNetX at UCR, I believe they've added another 20 million patients worth of data in there. So that's changed. Any findings from our original studies, you have to go back and see if they still hold true with an extra 20% added to the network. At any given day, some networks drop on and stay, some drop off, some stay on the network. And then, you also have changes to through propensity score matching. You're not always looking at the same people in each cohort, because every time you do a propensity score match for your findings, you're going to get new people drawn for that. So let's say you get to a point though, and you're like, aha, I have done it. My study is complete. I've got all my variables correctly in place. I've got my propensity score matching. Everything looks good. I want to freeze this and get a copy out so that I can write this up and not have to worry about it changing or having to rerun it or anything like that ever again. Well, the export all function can really help with that. So when you hit the export all function, this can export your propensity score matching and each outcome as a table and a PNG file to there. So it's going to give you a table as both an image and a CSV file, which is basically like an Excel file, right? And it's going to give you a graph with that image and the image of your graph and the data. So this can be really valuable because essentially it's like a snapshot of everything all in one time. And then you can go back and reference all of the data in there, and pretty much has just about everything you would need to know about your study in one place. And conveniently, it dumps all of these, your individual, you can see here, your individual findings, and you can unselect some if you don't want all of your findings. You just want findings 1 through 3. You can uncheck 4 and 5 and only get 1 through 3 if you want to do it that way. So it's going to output those all into a zip file. Just dump it straight to a zip file that looks like this. And I just wanted to mark this for people. This isn't a Word thing, but your Mac is going to look much the same. Inside the zip file, you're going to have your propensity score. It's called the baseline patient characteristics. That's your propensity score matching table. And then it's going to have your outcomes and tables and graphs thereafter, each one for if you're using the propensity score, the measures of association, MOA, and then it's going to have your Kaplan-Meier graph for each one. So here's MOA1, here's the image of the graph, large and small. The results from the graph, this is the numbers in the bar chart, for example. And then this is the table with all of your information about your analysis for that measures of association. And then again, for your Kaplan-Meier analysis as well. So this can be really, really useful for developing future derivatives based on your findings. Option 2, as I mentioned in session 4, is to export everything as a Word doc. And again, this is great to share with people if you need to summarize out all of your document, all of your ICD-10 codes and all of your information just into one place. The Word doc does a fantastic job of getting it all in there. So it makes it easy, as I said, to send it around to mentors and patients. You can save them as snapshots for later. And you also don't have to keep referring to the website, logging in, scrolling. You get it all in one document, and you can copy and paste out that. And again, here's your cohort criteria that you would find in there. That's all of the ICD-10 codes that you used to define your thing. And it also tells you a little bit about the logic, right? There's your OR variables, must have this, cannot have that. It also outputs, again, as I said in session 4, your outputs in your risk analysis to a table, and it basically keeps all that information pretty much the same. One thing to keep an eye out for is that it doesn't do p is less than 0.0001. It'll just say p is like 0.000, and you should not publish that. You should make it 0.0001. There's no such thing as a p of 0.000 because nothing is impossible to happen by accident or otherwise. So really useful. And again, the numbers are rounded a little bit, but it can be really useful for that. It also gives you your appendix A through C, which you can submit as digital appendices to your articles as well, because it includes all of the information. Again, it's got your text representation of the cohort definition, text representation of the analysis setup, and text representation of the outcomes definition. And if you have all of these things, you can basically rebuild just about anybody's cohort with a little bit of effort. So it preserves that for you, and so you can share that to other folks. So that's a little bit about the Word output, or the different output versions. One thing you can do that we're going to talk about a little more in a little while is you can actually use this Word doc, though, that you export to help with developing write-ups using AI. I know this is very controversial, and there's all sorts. This is a very new technology, and it can be very challenging to know what's ethical to use AI for in writing your manuscripts. But I'm going to advocate for, sometimes we're making steak when we're writing papers, and sometimes we're making hamburger. And a lot of your findings in TriNetX, if the AI helps you to write a really clear and accurate analysis of your findings, I think that's a fair way to use it, because it's not like you're writing a treatise about health justice and you really need to represent your own internal thought about it. This should be rote. This should be information that's just statements of numbers and how big they are or small they are compared to other numbers. It's pretty straightforward. So here's a prompt that I developed that you can use in uploading this to Google, to ChatGPT or DeepSeek, and we're going to talk about these tools a little later. You can upload your Word document and say, review the following omnibus output of a TriNetX study and extract all the outcomes and put them into a table listing, one, the outcome name, blah, blah, blah. You can see all these different factors. This basically describes exactly how a table in a manuscript might look. Create one uniform table, but organize the outcomes categorically by outcomes, complications, and other disorders. Make it as an easy format to paste into Google Docs. Highlight any rows with p-values less than 0.05. So I know, having used this a couple of times, that ChatGPT can do a pretty good job of extracting your data from the uploaded Word document and then turning that into a table that you can then paste into your Google Doc. So I think that's a very good way to use this to, number one, every time you change your analysis and get a new finding, trying to maintain your tables manually is very difficult. And we're going to see a tool that I developed to help manage that without AI. But using AI just to make sure that it's accurate, that it's updated all the numbers correctly, it's much less likely to make a mistake, and you can spot those mistakes a lot more easily. But using this tool, I think, is a great choice for that. Again, you can also do things that are really useful, like feed ChatGPT this little template text down here that tells it a little bit of like how to write up each of your findings and your outcomes in a really clear and easy to use way that will, again, you can integrate into your final draft and make sure all of your numbers are correct and all of that data is getting pulled correctly from your document into TriNetX. Or sorry, into your final document from the TriNetX Word doc. And so the template, I have this template text here that just tells it how to format your little write-up for this, so you can weave it together and then write it up really nicely for your final draft. Again, we want these numbers to be accurate and clear. And I often worry about the ways that ChatGPT or other kinds of things are impacting our writing, the way we do writing. But I feel like for this, it's pretty safe. You just want this to be accurate and clear, and that's the most important thing, more so than the labor of manually typing this out and making sure these numbers are all correct each time. I think ChatGPT can really help save some time with that. But now that we've talked a little bit about ways that ChatGPT or that AI and tools can help us with our work, I do want to turn a little bit to structuring a literature review. And this is a little bit of a bird walk, but this is something that I almost always talk with students about, and residents and other folks. Even when they say they know how to do a good lit review, I really want to emphasize the importance of knowing what a literature review is for when you're conducting a study like this. And I think this is a good moment at the end of our series to take a step back and do that, to make sure that you understand first the function, the purpose of a literature review is first and foremost to make sure that there's a need for your study, that your study, it establishes that there's a gap in the literature that your study is responding to. And I think to do that, I mean, look, when you're doing a literature review for your dissertation, part of it is to illustrate that you've read widely and you understand the deep theoretical sources. Most scientific literature is not like that. It is to establish a particular need. And you can do that in 5 parts with about 1,500 words or less. Usually for most journal articles, you get a maximum of about 750 words to do this. So in the assignment that I give to our medical students, I ask them to give me 250 words on why and who cares. Why is this an important clinical question that you're asking and investigating with TriNetX? What's the point of this? You also ask, what do we already know? And that's about 500 words. And that's where you do the conventional literature review stuff of really economically sharing and summarizing the research that already exists. The most important part is, where's the gap? What's not known in the existing research that your study will respond to and improve? And finally, 250 words on why is your project the right one to fill the gap, right? What is it about the way that you're conducting this that makes your study the correct one, the best way to do this, that you know how? And finally, later on, at the end of your study, you're going to tie your findings back to the research really clearly. And let's take a little bit of a look at how this is done. And I've got an example paper for you here. You can scan this QR code and find a copy of it. Even though it's broadly available, I believe it's open access, so you can find it. But there's a study looking at suicidal ideation or attempts in adolescents with obesity who are treated with GLP-1, I believe specifically semaglutide. This was published in JAMA Pediatrics, and it's a pretty typical but very well done paper. And as those of you know, pediatrics is a very difficult area to conduct human subjects research in. So this is a really good way for us to kind of track what happens when we're giving kids GLP-1s or when physicians are prescribing that. That's really important. And so if you look back at session 1, when I told you a little bit about what makes a high quality or a well-done TriNetX paper, I feel like this study does a lot of that and also does it very economically and shows you in a very clear way how this study, how to put together a literature review for one of these studies as you are developing it. So as I said a moment ago, and as many veteran researchers will tell you, most journals cap their research articles between about 2,500 and 3,000 words. Sometimes for highly qualitative studies, they'll give you a little more, but for a quantitative study like this, they would expect you to bring it in within that range and maybe even less. This literature review, which is quite erudite and quite well written, is less than 1 journal page, probably less than about 500 words, give or take. And they do include some additional research in the discussion sessions I mentioned a moment ago. But you can see here that part in green, that's the literature review. And when I work with a lot of students, they really spend time like, oh, I'm going to go do the literature review. And that's important for where you are developmentally, where students and maybe in residence and fellows are developmentally. But it's actually in some ways the shortest part of your study. Your methods and your analysis and your discussion, that's the real stuff of your paper. This is a justification for why your paper needs to exist. So it needs to be well thought out and short. So let's look at their paper and how they do this. So the why and who cares is usually part of the introduction section in that journal and those articles. There's usually not a special separate introduction and then literature review, though some journals do have that format. Your mileage may vary. But it's the purpose and need for your articles. Because I want to do it is not good enough. You need a compelling rationale for why the journal should give you any page space. And editors routinely reject submissions because they're unclear about why the study was necessary and what new is brought in by the study. This just happened with me on a paper where I was working with some students, and they did not do a good job of establishing the necessity of their study. And thus the editor said, why is this new? Why should we publish this? No, thanks. And they desk rejected it. So that was a lesson I think for the students, was to be very clear about why you're doing the study and who benefits from it and why scientific research needs your study. So you can see here, the study in that orange section up at the top, the very beginning of this article, they do a fantastic job of saying why this matters, right? Suicide is the second most prevalent cause of death in youth, with 18% of high school students reporting suicidal ideations. Pediatric obesity associated with increased risk for both depression and suicidality. Well, that's a really compelling rationale for this, right? It's really important to do this research because of the twin risks associated here. And they follow on with that as GLP-1 are increasingly used to ameliorate obesity in adolescents, there's a timely need to promptly investigate the potential association between GLP-1R and use in suicidality. And they go on to say, it could make things worse, it could make things better. We don't know, and that's why this study needs to be done. Lives are at stake. Pretty good why and who cares, right? Number two, what do we already know? 500 words that, as I mentioned a moment ago, but more of what we think of as the literature review. It's a summary of existing research that is relevant to your current study. You do not, and this is for all the students out there, do not need to go back to the definition of diabetes to establish that, unless that's something that can't be assumed for some reason in your written population, in the population you're writing for. You do not have to go back to the origins of society to explain some of these factors, right? You need to include what's relevant for your study. As I said, not every article ever written on the subject, that's for like a PhD or a DRPH or a doctoral degree, an academic doctoral degree as opposed to a clinical doctoral degree, where you would want to demonstrate mastery over the vast body of research, though that increasingly is becoming impossible given how much new medical research, something like 23 or more than 23,000 new articles every year. Medical research doubles every few years. It's impossible to stay on top of it. So the question here is, what's relevant to your study? You have to do that as part of a scholar, your scholarship. So, well, the main goal is not necessarily to educate people about the state of medical science in this area. It's to establish why your paper is necessary. And they do a really great job of doing. You can see this part in green, these two parts in green, actually from two different sections of that entry part. Really does a fantastic job of just summarizing what's already known and connecting that directly to their planned analysis, and doing a very economical and good job of that is kind of your main goal. Also, please note, you do not have to summarize each paper or study unless doing so provides a point about your study. It is possible sometimes to pull out a particular study and say, we will do a deep dive into the findings of Johnson and Murphy, and we're going to look at what their study found specifically, because that has an impact as to how we are doing our study. Otherwise, you'll find when you read these that they, here are 3 different citations in line that are not even referencing those specific papers, right? They're just, they are referencing those specific papers, but those papers are not being directly quoted. It's not necessary. So I see that a lot with students using a lot of analysis of papers when that's not really necessary at all. So you can see here, here's how they do it. A recent systematic review and meta-analysis found that adults with type 2 diabetes treated with GLP-1R showed significant reduction in depression rating scales compared with those treated with non-GLP-1R anti-diabetic medications. You can see how little of the original study they included in this summary, and that's really important. You do not have to do a deep dive unless doing so serves a broader point. You can see over here in this sentence, while some studies in adults suggest that GLP-1R may have protective effects against depression, they cite 5 papers, 16 through 20, right here without even blinking, right? They don't even say what those say beyond those that it suggests that GLP-1 may have protective effects against depression. So that's kind of how academic scholarship is done, right? We don't need to recap all of these papers. We need to connect to those papers and to make sure that we are clear about them saying what that they say and support what we say. And that's actually something you have to do as part of academic honesty, is make sure that your citation actually helps to support your case and isn't just being thrown in there randomly. So doing a good job on this really saves you a lot of word count and helps you be really clear. But in this one sentence, there are 7 citations. And so that's something I think med students would do well to learn as well. Again, where's the gap? Bad news: unless you're conducting a replication study, you should avoid repeating existing studies. That sucks, just because there are so many medical research studies out there of every flavor and type, of every research design. So unless your plan, which is actually a good use for TriNetX in some cases, is to go and redo and look at the differences in findings from past studies, which you could do, you're going to have to find a new gap. The good news is that almost every study in every body of literature has a gap that needs to be filled. There's something missing, some way of looking at it, some population that wasn't looked at, some new piece of knowledge that we've learned since that can play a really valuable role in developing the new your study, right? So, for example, this is very common in older studies. A lot of times, racial representation was not a factor that was really thought through. In randomized control trials especially. So you had big disparities in enrollment until maybe 7 years ago. So in fact, I believe until the 2010s, it was not required to recruit women into randomized control trials, which means a lot of medical research was being normed essentially on men. So great, guess what? It's time to go back and fix some of that, right? And to see whether, when we use real world data to look at this, maybe we'll see different things using these kinds of tools. And gaps in the research tell us where new knowledge needs to be developed based on new frameworks, theories, observations, populations, and approaches, as I said. And there's a bunch of different kinds of gaps. So there's evidentiary gaps and knowledge gaps and practice knowledge gaps, right? Methodological gaps, empirical gaps, theoretical gaps, and population gaps. So these are really the 7 kinds that were identified in Miles 2017, which is a pretty famous article on this subject. And this kind of helps you think through what is the kind of gap that I'm looking for in my analysis. So here they do a really good job. As I said earlier, they identify the why and who cares as GLP-1R are increasingly used to ameliorate obesity in adolescents. There's a timely need to promptly investigate potential association between GLP-1R use and suicidality. And similarly, in their in their discussion section, which kind of follows up on after their presentation of their data, they say, to our knowledge, the association between GLP-1R treatment and suicidal ideation or attempts in adolescents with obesity has not been directly investigated to date. That's the gap. That's what you're looking for. That's why this study is important. You can also say this up front earlier in your introduction section as well, but this is the kind of unequivocal statement of value of why this study is relevant. That's really important to be able to make and have done a good enough literature review to be able to make that claim properly. Finally, why is your project the right one to fill the gap? Well, a clear statement of why your project addresses the gap in the existing research is usually going to come towards the end with the strengths and limitations. So they say, additionally, while most clinical trials commonly exclude participants with a history of suicidal behavior, PSM allows us to include and match individuals based on their past psychiatric diagnoses. This approach allowed us to investigate clinical experiences with GLP-1R prescribed to adolescents with obesity and diverse psychiatric diagnoses. So this study is the right one to fill the gap because the affordances, the components of TriNetX that make it unique, allows this study to investigate something that is usually not done in the randomized controlled trial kind of paradigm. So that's really important to be aware of, and something very important to make sure you do in your paper is say, why is your paper the right one to fill that gap? And this can go in your literature review as well, or your methods section, depending on what you're working on. As I said, there's a bonus round along with your results. Discussion section is one of the most important. The results is just your factual reporting on your data. This is something I find a lot of students are maybe not as clear on, but when you have your analysis and your results coming after your methodology, that's the factual, just the facts, what you saw, no judgment, low inference is what we call it. Your discussion is where you get to say what all those numbers mean and how it refers to your original hypothesis or theories. It's about what you think it all means. And so you can see this paper's discussion, though, contains another 20 citations supporting their interpretation and their analysis. And that's really important to know to do when you're doing a literature review, is to find stuff that can support and reconnect your paper to the broader literature. And that's really important for establishing good quality work in your study. Yeah, so after you've done your analysis, usually this comes in and you can see here here's how they did that specifically. Several factors could explain the following. First, obesity during adolescence by itself is associated with diminished quality of life and increased risk for psychiatric disorders and specifically suicidal ideation. And it goes on like that, right? Tying everything back together, tying it to new sources, to existing sources, all of these things to really emphasize and strengthen the claim warrant relationship. Like, you made a claim, does the evidence warrant your claim? By using research, we can go beyond our own study and show how it connects to other papers, and that's really important. So that's literature reviews. There are going to be some folks out there where I'm sure that was very basic, but hey, I think I've been teaching literature reviews for a lot of years, and I think this is about as simple and as short as I can make it. It's about 12 minutes, so 14 minutes or so. So I think that's pretty good. But I also want to talk a little bit about next-gen tools. These would have been nice to have when I was in school, but I do want to talk a little bit about this because I think actually there have been some really amazing changes in the kind of front-end research components that we talk about a lot, like actually doing your literature review. So we're going to talk about AI real quick, and we're also going to talk about graph databases and how these things are related. So first, we all know this. I first started teaching about ChatGPT. I first used it in December of 2022. I was immediately shocked by how good it had gotten as a technology. I couldn't believe that it was usable in that way. And I've been using it ever since. So, however, really, really, really early on, like in the first couple of days of using it, I realized that it had that severe limitation that we've all experienced. That I asked it to write an academic literature review about the importance of medical student research, including citations. And it did. Look at that. Oh my God. I think we all had this experience of like, wow, oh my gosh, look at all that work that it did for me in like 30 seconds. That would have taken me like 2 hours to like sit down and read and write and think and reflect. Boom, done, ready to move on to the next section. And look at all these citations. Like, look, wow. I mean, I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, I've been reading for months and reading everything I could find on medical student research. I can't believe I missed all this stuff. Well, except when I started looking into these citations, we've all had this experience. It had hallucinated all of them. These are all fake citations, all of it, really. And then I said, I asked ChatGPT, I said, are the citations in the post above real? It said, I apologize, but I made a mistake. The citations I provided in the post are not real. These papers don't exist. So the confabulation, the hallucinations that ChatGPT engages in, and that all large language models engage in, are less of a problem today, but they're still an issue, and they may not be solvable anytime soon. So for lit researches, though, I've come to prefer perplexity.ai. And Perplexity, there are many physicians who are using open evidence, and that one's a good choice too. But I like Perplexity because it has a broader knowledge base in some ways than open evidence, so you can ask it other kinds of biomedical questions that may not necessarily be in the clinical space. Though open evidence does appear to have a better, it keeps things more on the rails in terms of clinical information. So why do I prefer Perplexity? Well, number one, these citations are real, right? It's looking at PubMed. It's looking at all these different platforms, these different databases to find and answer the questions that you're asking. And they're up to date. It's looking at stuff that's as new as PubMed has. And it allows you to really ask, if you ask the right kinds of questions, it can really help you get going on your TriNetX projects a lot faster. Usually I recommend letting people know if you've used ChatGPT or Perplexity, but and check every fact, every citation it gives you. Make sure that the article it cites actually says what the article says it does, what ChatGPT or Perplexity says it does. And ultimately, you as the author are responsible for the accuracy of the paper, not ChatGPT. So those are just some things. However, you can use it to defeat the tyranny of the blank page. As I said a few moments ago, you can have it help you develop your analysis really quickly and get your data out of the TriNetX Word doc and into a format that you can write up really nicely. Somewhat less controversial, but extremely useful is a technology called the graph database. And it's not the usual term for graph. A graph is a connection between 2 points in a system. So in this case, we're looking at a tool called LitMaps. And what LitMaps tells you here is if you feed it a paper or you search for an area of research and it gives you some papers to start with and you start checking them, it tells you how that paper connects to papers. What other papers have cited it? What other papers are popular that might be related to it? And it helps you kind of keep track of what you've been saving in your database. But I'm going to suggest a different tool. I suggest Research Rabbit for medical students, and partly because it's free, but also because it's extremely useful in its connections to Zotero, which I'll share notes. I'll tell you about in a moment. But basically, Research Rabbit and most of these other graph database tools, you start with selecting a paper to start with. And basically, it finds additional papers connected to your paper that are likely related to the interest that you have in that, right? So I put in a paper about health literacy as my first one, and then it started feeding me additional papers. And you can start to see over here in this diagram how those papers are all connected. And you can select other papers and add them to your pool as you find ones that are relevant. You can also organize them by time and by connected authors and things like that. So it makes it really, really easy to identify. I mean, the old days, the fear was, oh my God, I did this whole literature review, but I forgot this one paper. Well, this can help you spot those papers much more quickly than doing this manually in like Google Scholar or PubMed. So using these kinds of tools can be extremely valuable to add more stuff to your collection. And what's great is if you are using Zotero, which I strongly recommend you do, I used to use Mendeley. I was a big fan of it, but now Zotero is the best one. What I suggest is you get the online account for Zotero, and that can sync nicely with Research Rabbit. So basically anything you add to your bibliography in Zotero, which is a very easy and convenient way to manage stuff, can get imported into Research Rabbit, and anything you add in Research Rabbit gets pushed back into Zotero. So you can use these graph databases seamlessly with citation managers to really do some great work. So overall, if you're doing a rapid review, this is what I teach our students. Use Google Scholar and Perplexity to identify your initial pool of studies that are related to the area of interest that you're looking at. Then use Zotero to organize the studies and PDFs into nice little pools that you can draw from when you're writing. And you can use Research Rabbit to import your Zotero and tool studies and find more relevant studies that you might have missed, even in your ongoing searches through PubMed or Google Scholar. Then you can write your sections of your literature review, and you've got everything at hand. You can just grab what you need to cite your papers, and you can search through them, and you can use all the powers of Zotero and its notation technologies and stuff like that as you analyze your data and integrate in additional sources. And then again, to use the sources from your original review to contextualize your findings in the discussion section. So that goes back to your initial pool of studies that you pull in. So that's my main stuff to talk about with literature reviews and some next generation tools. Before we go on, I do want to talk about DeepSeek because it's a great new technology that came out a few months ago. When DeepSeek was released by a Chinese company, that's been working on an AI technology. It caused NVIDIA, the AI chip maker, it caused their company to lose $1 trillion of value in just a couple of hours. And that was a huge upset because this technology is very energy efficient and it's, let's say, comparatively energy efficient. And it's a much more straightforward technology than ChatGPT. And so, in addition to Perplexity, which you can use for literature review tools, and ChatGPT, which can help with a lot of complex tasks involving coding and data manipulation and tables and all sorts of stuff like that, you can also add DeepSeek to your tool belt. And what's really great about DeepSeek, and the reason I'm highlighting it for you in the context of TriNetX, is there's a lot of times where you're going to have to make methodological decisions, and you may not have anybody immediately around you who can advise you on the subject. And for me, I found that the AI thought process in DeepSeek really, really, really helped us to make some sticky decisions along the way in some of our studies. It's a really, really smart friend. So here you can see our question was, we're trying to isolate the impact of prostaglandins on rates of cesarean section in pregnant women using TriNetX. However, we are stuck trying to decide if we should exclude all women with preeclampsia from our cohort or use propensity score matching to reduce the bias and impact of preeclampsia on the final analysis. Preeclampsia is one of the reasons women receive prostaglandins to induce labor, but we don't want one cohort to have an overrepresentation of preeclampsia. What should we do? Well, you can see here, it did a really fantastic job of both understanding the question that we were asking and giving some additional context to it, right? So you can see that it was reasoning through our request. What are we trying to ask? What does it need to know? And in reading through this with our student, when we were working on the study, it was incredibly useful to see its thought process and how it understood preeclampsia as a potential confounder or not. And it really, I think, did a good job of understanding both our intent and our need. But what's nice about this is you can critically assess its chain of logic in a way that's very difficult to do with ChatGPT, where it's very hard to know how did it arrive at that decision or that summary. And DeepSeek does a very nice job of clarifying that for you and then summarizing it down into a set of directions for your for your decision. So that's DeepSeek. I recommend playing with it and giving it a try. You'll see, I think that it has a very valuable function in your toolkit. So as we keep going, I'm going to share a couple of ideas for representing your data when you're developing your final manuscripts. So one challenge that I often find in working with med students and residents and attendings is you all don't get a lot of training necessarily in data display. And that's exactly as it should be because you're becoming clinical medical experts, many of you, and that is what you're out there for. But I think one of the best ways to establish the validity of your findings is through mindful representation of your data. So we're going to talk a little bit about what does it mean to display data mindfully and what are some ways that we can do that. Well, there's a guy, Edward Tufte, who was very famous in the 2000s and, he still is around. And I believe he was at MIT for a long time, but he developed a series of books, and one of which, the most famous of which, is The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And in it, he had a very strong, I'm not going to say Jeremiad, but a very strong bias against the ways that visual representations of data had been co-opted in the office of the 80s and 90s. And he does a really, really interesting reading of how it is that the way that PowerPoint was used actually made the Voyager, sorry, not the Voyager, the Discovery, no, the explosion of the space shuttle in the 1980s, not only worse, but also after the fact when they were doing their analysis of the accident itself, it made it much harder. Oh, it was the Challenger. Thank you. The Challenger explosion in the 80s, it made it much harder for them to learn the right lessons from it because they were using all sorts of bad visual representations that was actually polluting their understanding. And PowerPoint and our office productivity tools had made all of that worse. And this is actually, I always pick this one. This is the diagram he believed was the best visual representation of data ever made in like hundreds of years. And this is actually a map of Napoleon's army as it went to Russia, which is the kind of beige line over here, and after their defeat and return to France later on. So you can see this gigantic pool of people come shooting out of France across Germany into Russia, and Moscow gets stopped here at the gates of Moscow, gets defeated and turned back. And you can see by the time it returns, it's this little tiny black trickle all the way over here at the end. So if you think about it, there is geography, right? This is all the way from Eastern Europe to Moscow. There's space, right? Or not space, but volume. How many soldiers were going, as represented by the thickness of the line. You have direction. You have different soldier groups going in different places. You have temperature. This is the temperature here of the weather at different phases of the thing. So there's like 15 kinds of data. That's an exaggeration, but not too far, being represented in this diagram. And that is an incredible feat to have done in a time, by the way, before computers. So really interesting as well. But that gets the idea of mindful representation of data. I want to show you just quickly, these are a couple of examples of what I think are mindless representations of data that don't help us make any decisions and it takes so much cognitive load to read these two diagrams that you should not be doing stuff like this. So mindful visualization asks you to think about how you're using data representations to achieve your communication goals and avoiding the kinds of representations that increase viewers' cognitive load and don't add any value compared to, say, a table. And they're very hard to read. So I'm not going to say never use pie charts. However, the amount of visual space that a pie chart takes up compared to, say, a graph, and the amount of ability to understand differences in scale when they've done tests and things like that, just do a bar chart or a table. Ultimately, that's so much easier and communicates so much more. What is this? What does company E's share? What does that mean in relationship to company B? How much bigger or smaller is it really? Even when they tell you the percentage and the numbers, it can be very difficult to actually interpret these data. So I get a lot of students bringing me pie charts of stuff to show out of 100. Don't do that. Just show a graph showing this. This makes it a lot easier to compare quantitatively what's going on with your different groups, or just put it in a table. So much easier. So I'm not going to beat up on some of these other representational types because there's no such thing as one good, perfect type of data. But I'm going to take you through a couple really quick that are valuable, and then I built you some tools to use. So think about how to communicate your analysis to your audience, and things like bar graphs, which are great for comparison of two or more cohorts. We got forest plots, Kaplan-Meier curves, and tables. We're just going to talk about those really quick. For those who I've been working with in the last couple of months, you may have seen that I've been talking a lot about our TriNetX publication toolkit. This is a free set of tools that our students can use that basically enables you to do all of the things that I'm about to share. So first up is a bar chart. I thought that students could do this on their own, but ultimately I find that they've asked me to develop a bar chart making tool for them that they can use. So you can see here, if you go and use this, you can change these numbers and it'll change all of this. You can adjust all sorts of different components. You can flip the orientation to vertical if you want. And one thing I thought that was good about this is it at least makes these uniform. So everybody's going to see the same kinds of tools. And you can even decrease, like, oh, okay, you want to decrease the distance between the groups. You can make them bigger or smaller. You can have spacing between bars, all sorts of stuff like that. You can make them thicker or thinner, all sorts of choices, colors, and all things like that. So I think what's gained by using bar charts is they really, really allow you just to see relative difference between two sets of groups, and it allows you to really be clear about what's happening in this relationship. I'm also going to recommend forest plots, which are very, very useful. Again, there's a tool for that in the toolkit. You can edit. I'm going to release documentation for how to use all of this. but you can basically enter your risk, odds, or hazard ratio, and it'll generate this forced plot for you. And what forced plots do is very useful. In fact, we can turn on the numerical annotations for this, regenerate it, and you can see it tells you very, very handily that the mean risk ratio in this situation is 1.2, and that the 95% confidence interval is between 1 and 1.5. And what's really useful about that is it allows you to be able to show people how reliable your findings are, especially if you have a bunch of them. If you've got more than two and you want to show people comparison of multiple outcomes across a single cohort, this is a really good way to summarize all of those outcomes in here. We talked about the Kaplan-Meier curves in past sessions and how to read them, but routinely people ask me about how to make them. And there isn't an easy way in Excel or anything like that. But what you can do, if you follow my earlier directions on how to download the Kaplan-Meier analysis from one of your data sets from earlier, you can double click on this and add it to the TriNetX Bootcamp website. And it'll allow you to manipulate and draw the Kaplan-Meier survival curve for your data really easily. You can set how many days you want including there. Maybe you only want 3,500 days. And then you want to set the, oh, look, that's great, but maybe we want to cut the analysis a little bit so we can have a better zoomed in view. You can see how much of this space is just empty. So you can say, I want the y-axis to start at, the y-axis to go from basically 0.55 to, or let's say even 0.54. And so you'll find that you can actually zoom in and get a much better view, higher resolution view of the area of your graph that's of interest. So these are great for comparisons of two cohorts over time. Again, earlier we were talking about propensity score matching tables and being able to use your outputs. If you use this tool, you can upload your propensity score matching data directly from TriNetX, the table that comes out of there. Remember the baseline cohort information. You can upload it straight into here. And I've got some options in here to merge, so you don't have every row saying BMI 9083. You can just duplicate that and it takes away that text. You can add before and after propensity score matching. You can also edit the table, and using some of these functions, if you click at the group settings below, you can edit this table. You can move the rows and columns around however you want, and you can drag, for example, I created these nice little headings that you can insert, and we've got conditions and lab values. My study doesn't have any medications, but you can drag down the lab values to here. And then when you click this little arrow button here, it'll lock that in and then give you a nice little table that you can paste into Word, or you can edit the rows and the columns really easily and add them to your poster post haste. So propensity score matching. I also created a tool for helping you develop your tables for your studies. So you'll see, if you look at the outcome table generator, you can upload your findings from the TriNetX output from that you download, your individual outcomes from your MOA, your measures of association. And when you input it, it'll spit out these nice little formatted tables with your data, and makes it really easy to deal with. You can increase the number of decimal points, and show risk as a percentage. You can change the colors. Let's say you need a black and white version of this to submit to a journal. Boom, there's monochrome. And you can paste these really quickly right into your article, and it's very easy to use and very nice for that kind of thing. All right, well, we're coming towards the end. We're at the finish line for our TriNetX Bootcamp. I just want to share a couple of examples from students that were shared with permission. First, I think there's a really great one done in the past on racial disparities in melanoma metastasis, done by one of our students, Roy Mendoza, who's gone on to residency in dermatology. And he also actually turned this into a paper, which was really great, into a letter to the editor that uses the data from TriNetX to make an argument for the need for greater equity in the surgical treatment of melanoma. So I think that's really cool. And to use data this way to make an impact on social determinants of health that way, and outcomes for patients from underserved groups. I think that's really, really wonderful. We also have a student who got really interested in psychiatric disorders and treatment for kids who had cancers in the past. There's actually very, very little research on what happens beyond, in the 10, 15, 20 years post cancer treatment. What happens to those kids? Do they develop PTSD or other kinds of psychiatric disorders? And the student did a really great job of using TriNetX to analyze that. Here's one that got into stroke. I think she did a really fantastic job of looking at, in fact, this is an interesting case where the student found an existing study that had a number of different methodological flaws that had been pointed out in a related, in a letter to the editor about that study. It was an existing TriNetX study that had these flaws. And so the student went back to TriNetX and actually resolved some of those flaws and was able to come up with a much more robust finding for the study based on the NIHSS, which is the stroke scale that they have. So using that to help really understand alteplase and tenecteplase in context. So that was a very, very good study and very well done. Finally, I think this is a particularly great example of a student's work here at UCR. Raymond Jackson developed a study looking at health disparities in the use of omalizumab and dupilumab for Black patients with severe asthma. So when we looked at this, we looked at outcomes for acute respiratory distress, whether people were developing that. And it turns out that just passing in doing a literature review on asthma treatments, Raymond found that there's just an item that apparently when they were doing a study on dupilumab, that they found that Black patients were being prescribed dupilumab at lower rates than white patients. Dupilumab is a newer drug. It's not replacing, but it's a newer version than omalizumab. And it has fewer side effects and better efficacy, according to existing clinical research and clinical data on that. However, it's not clear, it's difficult to assess whether any of this makes a difference for patients, whether there is, worse outcomes for Black patients because they're not getting this. So I think Raymond did a really good job of developing a 3-chambered analysis here. The first being that he established that, yes, we could also replicate the data showing that dupilumab is superior to omalizumab in controlling acute respiratory distress as a result of asthma, chronic asthma. Then number 2, he was able to illustrate that white patients were in fact getting dupilumab at higher rates than omalizumab during the time frame since dupilumab was released. This could be related to a lot of different things: access, doctor's knowledge, or insurance, right? All of those things are social determinants of health that are directly related to and directly mediated by a person's the box a person checks on their racial categorization form. Finally, though, the question was, does that make a difference? And yes, it turns out that Black patients with dupilumab have lower rates of acute respiratory distress than Black patients with omalizumab. And that winds up meaning that this disparity is actually making things worse for those patients. So I strongly recommend that, if you're thinking about doing a TriNetX study to look at health disparities, doing it in a way that's got a nice, strong connection across these 3 analyses really helps to illustrate that the findings are what we think they are. So I want to share those examples because one of the last things we're going to look at in this series is the anatomy of a science poster. And a lot of this is for medical students who've never made one of these before and are not familiar with it. The title of your project, basically this is the template that I give everybody on this when they come to UCR School of Medicine. Not because it's great or I'm the greatest or whatever, but this is pretty much 99% of all posters you're ever going to make are going to look something like this. Going to have these basic sections to them. I actually made an updated version of this on our scholarly activities page where the discussion section is a little longer and the limitations is over here, but pretty much these are the right sections and then just about the right amount of space for each one. You can go and download it, but I think let's just talk really quickly about what you want to do with it. Most posters are about 1,200 words max. You're going to have 2 to 3 tables in there. So that's going to include your table 1, which is your propensity score matching table, as well as 1 to 2 other tables that are going to summarize your data. You're going to usually have 1 to 2 graphics. So that's a bar chart or a Kaplan-Meier curve, whichever is easier. And you're going to have 5 to 6 references, and those are going to go in the nice box in the lower right-hand corner. A lot of times these days, though, people are actually saving themselves a lot of this space and using it for other stuff by putting a QR code for their references and having it linked to a Google Doc with their QR code. And that's a really good way to do things. But as you can see here, it's a pretty straightforward format. No sections more than about 300 words. And the whole exercise here is to be really brief and to describe your study in a very, very concise way. Here's the poster I made for my statins and Alzheimer's one. I never submitted this to anywhere yet because we're going to go for a manuscript. But basically, you can see roughly how I would recommend laying things out. So I've got my cohort diagram over here. It's a little blurry because this is a screenshot. I got my cohort diagram over here. I got my cohort before matching, my demographics. I got my cohort after matching. And I've got my data describing the outcomes really simply in there as well. So this is generally kind of how I recommend doing it. And you can see over here some of the, like the references I include in there with and our limitations of future research are over here. So anticipate doing something kind of similar to this, maybe nicer looking though. All right, we are in the final section. I just wanted to leave us with some future directions after completing teaching of this bootcamp for the second time. I've got some ideas for the future that I think our students and faculty and residents might be interested in. The first is I have heard people express and say, oh, wow, I've looked at TriNetX projects, man, everything's been done. There's like 1,000 of them. And this actually harkens back to some of my experience working with some folks at UCR School of Medicine using the NEISS database. The NEISS is the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System. And basically, anytime somebody shows up to the emergency room with an injury, that gets logged. What caused the injury, what type of injury it was, what part of the body, how old the person was, what sex they were, all that kind of stuff gets logged in this electronic injury surveillance system. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of posters and abstracts and studies based on the NEISS. There's over 5,000 studies and counting. And when I was working with students, we always were able to come up with kind of creative or new approaches to using this data set to investigate questions that actually do have some kind of public health import. In fact, we had one student who did an epidemiology, an update of an existing study, a past study from like 2005. He did a 20-year update looking at injuries related to fireworks, and that actually came out on the 4th of July, which was really funny. But the student did a very, very thorough job of analyzing the data and putting together a very good manuscript on that subject. But this data set didn't have any clinical data. It's just injuries, demographics, and a brief summary. It's focused on consumer goods and injuries like air rifles and household solvents and air conditioners and weights and God knows what else, pots and pans, knives and forks. But based on our use of the NEISS, I believe that there are thousands and thousands more studies to do in TriNetX, that the depth of clinical data in there, that the kinds of questions we can ask, limited though they may be in a lot of ways, are really, really interesting. I think there's a lot to do. So I just wanted to present a couple of additional ideas. So one thing I've seen a lot of students bring is case reports. So students do by nature a lot of case reports, and case reports, for those who are not familiar, are single patient studies that provide really detailed information about how one specific clinical situation was managed. However, there are some real questions about the validity and utility of these. For example, over 60,000, that's 60,000 cases are published every year across all specialties, and over 200 case report journals exist across all the specialties. That is a lot of pixels being used for these case reports. But it's fair to ask, are all these cases new and novel clinical situations that will help physicians make decisions about courses of treatment? Or more cynically, are they academic litter that just fills up the landscape with unclear reports of variable quality? We have some case reports that are really detailed and well put together that are going to help out with clinical decision making in the future. And we have other case reports that are just not very good, and they're just out there sitting on some server till the end of time. No one will ever cite them. They'll have an impact factor of 0, and that's it. So, are case reports valuable? I don't know. But I do know that if you're going to do a case report, you might as well do a TriNetX study on top of it to investigate that issue further. You might ask questions like, how rare are the cases like the one you observed? What percentage of them are dispatched in the way you observed? How frequently do they experience complications, the patients, afterwards? A lot of times with case reports, you don't know what happened to the person long term because they've exited the case, right? They're gone and on with the rest of their life, and the case is closed, right? Once they've been healed, or once they die, or once whatever happens, right? But what happens years later down the line, and with other complex situations? So I think that would be a really valuable way to extend case reports into the future. One other thing that I think is going to be really valuable in the future is to mine meta-analyses. So more meta-analyses and systematic reviews are released each year. Though variable in quality, they are really useful in identifying important limitations and new directions in studies. And while many prospective studies are too expensive to replicate or redo, TriNetX might be able to shine some light on the issues identified in meta-analyses. So meta-analyses may be a rich source for future questions, and a great way to assess what needs to be done and what TriNetX can do well for folks. So those are some thoughts on the future directions. That's it for now. That is the end. I'll have more stuff in the future. You can email me. You can check in with me anytime you want and see what's going on. And I'll be happy to share that. I want to thank everybody who's made it this far. I know based on our informatics on the analytics for our videos, not everyone makes it to the end, but I appreciate it if you did. And thank you so much for watching. Let me know what I can do to help you out. I'm here to serve you and to serve the students at the UCR School of Medicine. So please let me know what I can do for you. And see you, Space Cowboy. We are done. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.